I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to reduce antibiotic prescriptions in care homes by 30% to the benefit of those patients. There's an estimate that 30% of the carbon footprint of the NHS is for diagnostic tests. Let's take those blood tests into the patient's home and let the data do the traveling.
Welcome to the conversation. Today on Trailblazers, Johnny is speaking to Paul Ko Ferrigno, founder and CEO of éclateral, a company working to make lateral flow tests more effective. We hope you enjoy the episode. Be sure to subscribe and also follow us on social.
Paul, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Talk to us a little bit about éclateral, the work that you're doing and the journey that you've been on.
Okay, so éclateral was inspired by a publicity campaign by the Royal National Institute for the Blind. So big debt to them. They inspired the invention that led to the technology that I'm going to talk about. Their campaign was called Patty is Having Sex Again. And it was about a young blind woman, had a one-night stand, and 2 weeks later misses her period. And that blind woman has nowhere to go. She can't read a pregnancy test by herself. So whatever she feels about that potential outcome, she needs someone else to read it. And that doesn't feel right because it's still not solved today as an issue. But the idea was, let's take the pregnancy test, let's make it electronic instead of visual, and let's use the mobile phone to get that information to that young blind woman.
Yeah.
So that's the inspiration for the technology. What éclateral is now in a position to do, having built that platform that is sort of accessible, if you like, is to put a reader, a lateral flow reader, and I'll tell you a little bit more about lateral flow, a lateral flow reader in every home so that you can bring diagnostic testing out of a hospital into the home and give those people the information that they want to have so that they control their own health. And it's about reducing the burdens on GPs. It's about reducing the burdens on the NHS and putting people in control.
Yeah. So obviously, I'm pretty sure everyone who hasn't been living under a rock is familiar with a lateral flow for testing COVID, at least. Yeah. What further applications does lateral flow have, and how does it feature into what you're doing?
Sure. So we are, as you're absolutely right, all familiar now with the lateral flow test from COVID, but we all forget that lateral flow testing is the basis of the pregnancy test. It was the basis for diabetics testing blood sugar. There was probably 7 billion lateral flow tests taken around the world every year, just on the basis of the sales of the 200 companies that are manufacturing them. They're ubiquitous in healthcare, blood iron, iron and infection in urine. You can test for it using lateral flow, but also in environmental monitoring. So if you want to look at E. coli contamination in river water, if you want to be looking at mercury contamination in that same place or in drinking water, those are lateral flow tests.
Wow, that's incredible. I think Oxford probably would have wanted to have had one of those a couple of weeks back. So obviously you've brought the device with you today. Talk to us a little about the Opal.
Yeah, so the Opal device, there was 4 components really to what we do. There's the lateral flow test that everybody's sort of familiar with, except now you can't see the lines on our lateral flow test because what we've done is put an array of electrodes on top of those lines that you used to see. So you'll think about those red lines. Yes. What causes those red lines is gold nanoparticles that are clumping together and reflecting the light in a way that your eyes could detect. So the amount of gold that accumulates is proportional to the amount of whatever it is that you're trying to measure. The gold, though, is a metal, so you can measure it electrically by looking at how much current can flow through those lines. Electrical current can flow through those lines. So that's what we've done is use a reader, which is the Opal reader, to both power the test, but also to analyze the amount of current that goes through. So this device, which is a pocket-sized device now, small, costs us less than £20 to make. I should probably not have revealed that, but there we are. That represents £2,000 worth of lab equipment, wow, which was a benchtop device, as big as a microwave, basically. We've reduced that down to a pocket-sized device.
Incredible.
Low-cost device. Yeah, we're really proud of that, actually. That powers the test, but it also communicates via Bluetooth with your smartphone. And it's your smartphone that tells you what test you're using and how to perform the test and gives you the information back if it's appropriate. So for some tests, you want to be the only person who knows. A pregnancy test, for example, is a very personal, private piece of information. But there are other test applications we can think about. For example, a prostate cancer patient, a man living with prostate cancer who isn't going to die of it, because most men don't die of prostate cancer. They live with it and die of something else eventually. That man might want to be watching his tumor, but he doesn't want to be the person to self-diagnose with a worrying change. So you can send the data remotely through your mobile phone off to our server, and our server can push it to the consultant in the hospital, and then you get medical review of the information that comes out. So we're really trying to cover the full gamut of applications for people who might want to be testing at home. Everything from just a well-being test, how are my iron levels today? Did that massage that I just have lower my cortisol? Whatever it might be, all the way through to how's my cancer?
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely is incredible. I mean, it makes me think about all of us wanting more information from wearable devices, your Whoops, your Auras, and we're looking at our fitness data, but equally now we've got continuous glucose monitors in Zoes and all of that sort of stuff. So this is really just the next step in terms of us being able to have more of a read on our health and what's going on.
Really well into that whole ecosystem, actually. So a lot of people are just using apps, simple apps, as a way of tracking their symptoms without even using a wearable. But wearables do add that extra level of information. But what a wearable doesn't do is look at what is happening inside your body. At best, they're able to track your pulse and your heart rate and your temperature. So the ability to look inside is what we bring.
So what's the most common use case that you're using? I mean, we've spoken about a couple of different potential use cases that you've touched on there. What's the most common use case at the moment, and kind of where do you want to play a role next?
Yeah. So we are pre-market, so we haven't launched the test yet. We had a COVID test that was ready to go at the end of COVID. It took us 2 years to develop that first test. And unfortunately, vaccination and the rest of it, testing was no longer such a big deal. We didn't place the device on the market. So what we've done is look to see what are the other potential applications are and where we should be. And we've identified 2 areas of need. One is in antimicrobial stewardship. So antimicrobial resistance is the second largest threat to humanity after climate change. It is a massive deal. 25,000 people across Europe were dying of an antibiotic-resistant infection in 2021. And the data are a little bit difficult to get, but it looks at least 12,000 people in 2022 died of antibiotic resistance in the UK. So what that means is the infection that these people had wasn't treatable with the antibiotics that were available.
Yeah.
And that can simply be that the wrong antibiotics were given, or it could be that no antibiotic would have worked for those patients. It's a massive problem. The way to overcome antibiotic resistance is to stop using antibiotics so widely, not to stop using them, but to stop using them so widely. And that is called antibiotic stewardship. The reason that they're used so widely is that the symptoms that patients have when they have a viral infection, which isn't treatable by antibiotics, or a bacterial infection, which is treatable with antibiotics, it's the same symptoms. And so the doctor doesn't know what to do. And so a test that tells the doctor whether it's a bacterial infection or a viral infection would allow them to prescribe correctly. And the data that are out there, the clinical studies that have been done, show that you can decrease prescriptions by at least 30% with a test for a protein called CRP, which is a human protein. It's a protein in our blood, and it goes up if you've got an infection. It goes up a little bit if it's a viral infection. It goes up a lot if it's a bacterial infection. So it's a good way to distinguish between the two. So that's what we've identified as the first test that we're going to develop and take to market. And I'll tell you how we're going to do that if you like.
Absolutely, please do.
Okay. So I think the use case that we were first thinking about, because we're all about home diagnostics, is parents. Right. So we've talked about pregnancy testing. The next step in that sort of journey of the family is you've got a
9 months later, hopefully, all being well.
Exactly. If that was your desired outcome, yep. So that child will be breastfed, and breastfeeding often leads to anemia in the mother, so low blood iron. So we were thinking a ferritin test, a blood iron test would be a useful thing for that woman who's already got a reader at home. If she's been using our reader for pregnancy testing, can then be doing blood iron. But then that child eventually will stop breastfeeding and will go to nursery and start bringing home all kinds of diseases.
Yeah.
Anybody who's a parent will recognize that story and will have experienced their own, colds and coughs that the child has brought home. Children are little incubators for infection. So what we wanted to do was to put a CRP test into every home to allow the parents to decide whether or not that fever that child had merited getting the child dressed up, taking them down to the doctor's surgery and asking for antibiotics, or whether it's something that child's going to recover from, just a viral infection. Let's give them some paracetamol and keep that temperature down and see how we get on. While we think that is something that people do want, and everybody that we've spoken to, a parent that we've spoken to has said, yes, oh my God, I want that. For us as a small company to be able to sell to 6 million parents or whatever the number is in the UK is too hard. So what we decided to do is to go through more established routes, if you like, to get to market. So instead of selling one to many, we'll sell one to one and let the partner take the test to market. Our routes, we think, are through community pharmacies or through care homes and through care homes. Community pharmacies are really interesting because the government has just allowed pharmacists to prescribe antibiotics for seven common conditions, of which the cold is not one. So if you go to your pharmacist with a cough, they can't give you the antibiotics that you might need. If you go to them with an earache, they can. It seems a bit arbitrary, but there we are. But we think that community pharmacies in time will be able to prescribe for coughs and colds. And so we think that pharmacists might benefit from access to our test. The second place that we've been thinking about is care homes, where the elderly are the immune systems get worse. As
immunocompromised, very vulnerable people.
Yeah. And also overuse of antibiotic in care home can come with its own problems. A care home resident with diarrhea is an added problem for the diarrhea is a very common side effect of taking an unnecessary antibiotic. So we think the care homes are a good place to put the test. And I think that with those two routes of exposing people to what the care home, to what the Opal test looks like, that's also a good way for us to get the story out about what the test can do for the rest of the family.
Yeah, that's incredible. So what's the second use case that I took us on a slight detour?
Very good. The second use case is in women's health. So women's health, massively underserved. And I know that you've had people on your podcast to talk about that, as well as to talk about community pharmacies. So you've got your finger on the pulse. The women's health. So 1% of health tech funding goes to companies working in women's health. That's according to Forbes. Massively underserved in the private sector as well.
That's actually quite depressing.
It is really depressing. The UK does really 4 times better than the rest of the world at 4% of funding in the UK going to. So good news and bad news. And depressingly bad news. So women's health is massively underserved. We've talked about pregnancy testing. We've talked about breastfeeding. At the very other end of the fertility journey, if you like, is the menopause, the perimenopause, which I think you've also covered.
We have indeed. Yeah. We had the fantastic Deborah Evans of Remedy.
Yeah. And I enjoyed her podcast a lot, actually.
Phenomenal. Yeah. Absolutely amazing lady.
Yeah. So let's say that today there were probably 3 million women in the UK going through the perimenopause, of whom something like 80% are experiencing some kind of symptom. So not every woman going through the perimenopause has symptoms, but most of them do. 1 in 10 of those women will leave work early because of the severity of those symptoms. And I can't remember what the number is, but for some percentage of those women, the symptoms can last for 12 years. I mean, this is not a small problem. One of the issues, I think, for clinicians, and there's no true diagnostic pathway for the perimenopause, is that the symptoms of the perimenopause can overlap with so many other things, from cancer to early dementia, to hot flushes in cancer, hot flushes in the perimenopause. How do you know, as someone experiencing them, what you've got?
Yeah.
Brain fog could be early dementia, could be the perimenopause. How do you know what you've got? And those are just 2 of the 80-odd symptoms that women can experience as they're going through this. So we think a test for the perimenopause would also be useful. And the data absolutely support that. So there was something like 11 million searches a month on Google Analytics, including the word menopause in the UK. Wow. It's a massive, massive problem.
It's a huge problem, and especially when you consider the downstream implications of not getting effective treatment, HRT or other interventions with osteoporosis. Alzheimer's now is having a strong correlation as well with untreated women.
Women can take up to 6 visits to a GP to get the right diagnosis.
100%.
But it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
but not ridiculous. It's frustrating. I think it's the right.
It's just a challenge that we absolutely need to deal with, and we have the tools and mechanisms to deal with that. With that, actually, one of the things I was going to ask is, I could see a huge implication of this, and talking about how this relates to women's health. Obviously, one of the other challenges is in clinical trials.
Yeah.
And underrepresentation of women in clinical trials, because often there's challenges with, if there's, I think it's 9 miles from your home to the place that you have to submit your results, you see a 40% drop off in participation in clinical trials.
That's exactly right. So thank you for picking up on that. We think that's another area where we can add massive value to the industry. So you're absolutely right. The burden on a patient, if they sign up for a clinical trial, is huge. They do have to travel regularly to a hospital for blood tests. Let's take those blood tests into the patient's home and let the data do the traveling instead of the patient having to do the traveling. So as I said, we're on the cassette, you can't see, or the patient can't see, what the result is. And one of the things that's key in a clinical trial is that you don't influence the way that the patient feels by letting them see the data.
Yeah.
Because there's something called the placebo effect, which is very powerful and can completely change the outcome of the trial. If the patient sees a result that implies that they're feeling worse, they'll feel worse. And that will affect the outcome of their questionnaires and so on. So let's keep the patient at home. Let's stop them dropping out from the clinical trial because they're dropping out because of the burden of travel, as you say. And it costs £740,000 a year to have a patient in a phase 3 clinical trial.
Wow.
And if you've got that dropout rate that you've just talked about, you can see how a lot of that investment can be lost, can be wasted. So it's not just to help the patient, but by keeping them in that clinical trial so they can potentially benefit from the treatment. And certainly the wider patient population can benefit from the information that's coming out of that clinical trial. But it also benefits the clinical trial providers and the pharma companies by maximizing their return on investment through the use of a device like this.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think this was a little while ago, but we did a piece that was around the journey from molecule to market, and on average, it's usually 10 years drug development and 2 billion invested in that. Yeah. So the return on investment for a pharma company is absolutely something that they're thinking about, and if they've got underrepresented populations within that trial data, it's going to have a downstream consequence for them in that regard.
And we talk about the costs to patients of new drugs coming onto the NHS. Those costs are so high in the first few years because by the end of the time that it's taken to take that drug to market, there's only a limited patent life in which the pharma company can recoup its investment, not just in that drug that is brought to market, but all of the other failed drugs.
Yeah.
And there's 100 failed drugs for every one that comes through to market. Massive costs that they need to recover.
Yeah.
If we can decrease pharma companies' costs, we'll decrease costs of drugs in the future as well, or keep them a little bit lower than they are.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the questions that I had around the impacts that devices like that Opal could have in broader healthcare systems. What's the sort of impact and scale of the impact that we could be looking at with reducing that kind of burden on a patient having to go to a GP surgery? You think about how many appointments that are had unnecessarily that could be alleviated with a test from home.
That's absolutely right. So there's an estimate that 30% of the carbon footprint of the NHS is for diagnostic tests. So it's not just the financial costs as well as the time costs on GPs. It's also the carbon footprint. So like I said, antibiotic resistance is the second biggest threat to humanity. We're also thinking about the biggest threat to humanity, which is the carbon footprint of diagnostic testing in the NHS, which is huge. There were 35 million prescriptions written for antibiotics every year in the UK. That's potentially 35 million trips to a clinician that could be avoided, and 35 million times what I think the cost of a GP visit is something like £10 to, that's how the NHS budgets it. So it's £350 million. We should be able to avoid a lot of those with this kinds of tests. So yeah.
That's that in and of itself, the 35 million, that's half the population are having antibiotics every year.
Well, it's more likely that probably a quarter of the population are having more than one prescription.
Rounds
Yeah.
That's absolutely crazy.
And when you think that at least 30% of those are unnecessary, at least 30% of those are unnecessary prescriptions as well.
Yeah. One of the questions that I have on a more practical note with regards to this is obviously integration through systems. So I was at Digital Health Rewired recently, and one of the panel discussions that was taking place was around how within a hospital setting, facilities, IT, estate management all need to come together when any new technology or solution is provided. How are you alleviating and kind of upskilling the GP surgeries and helping them with that transition?
So as I say, we're pre-market, so those conversations are all very early. What we're finding very frustratingly is that almost every GP clinic has its own software system. There's at least 3 providers that are beginning to penetrate nationally, but even that is 3 different systems that we have to be able to integrate with. So that's a barrier for us, actually, is IT. Is it going to be about educating GPs? I don't think so. I think because GPs are already using even Google Health and other online platforms to help them with their diagnosis. So I don't think there's going to be a massive problem in getting GPs to adopt this kind of technology. But we need to integrate with the systems that they're already using. Even in care homes, it's the same problem, except it's another set of IT providers who are servicing care homes versus the NHS. So we think of ourselves as a healthcare company, but our computer team are telling us, actually, no, you're a software company. It's
well, it's one of the biggest challenges that I've definitely seen with the exposure that I've had to the healthcare system is there is an awful lot of fragmentation of systems.
Yeah.
And that sort of leads me to believe that there maybe needs to be some sort of standardization of the systems that we're using. And that maybe is something that's more of a governmental intervention that needs to happen, because
they have tried, to be fair. NHS Digital, they've invested a lot of money in trying to get it. It's all failed. And it's not clear why it hasn't worked out. Although I suppose if you look at the post office scandal, you might say that having a single IT provider is a risk. But it has proven to be. I'm sure that we will get to a point where there is a single system or a single way of interfacing with multiple systems. And I think that it absolutely has to get.
No, I agree that there has to be, because digital is the single longest lever that we have in scaling human intervention, and integrating something like this into an existing system within a GP's practice, for example, where you can maximize the amount of time that GP has to best serve the patients that most need it.
Yeah.
And then also all of the other factors that come into that conversation that you've touched on, the carbon footprint, the amount of money that it saves, the amount of time that it's all pointing to the same outcome, and the inevitability of that needing to happen.
Yeah.
It's something that really occurs to me that we need to, and it does, it's one of the conversations that I keep coming back to, or I think, how does that happen? And it's something that I'm very curious about in terms of who needs the right education, who needs the right kind of data put in front of them to galvanize them to make that decision or make that legislation or make that happen. That's probably a topic for another.
I think that there's 3 sets of people who need educating. There's the patients, except I think Nielsen released a report in the last couple of months showing that 48% of people are already making active decisions about their lifestyle and healthcare. So people are increasingly well educated, and the pandemic, for all of the downsides of it, the pandemic has helped enormously with that. You're right, the healthcare practitioners need to be brought on board. Healthcare practitioners have a historical reluctance to use lateral flow tests. They're happy to use them themselves because they can see what's happening. They can see that the patient sample is the right sample going on to the test, the right amount of sample, and that the test is being read at the right time. And they worry, I think, quite rightly, that some of us in a rush might try and read a test at 2 minutes instead of waiting 10 minutes and get a false negative result just because there wasn't time for that development to happen. So we need to be able to show to healthcare professionals that the technology that we're developing, although it's lateral flow testing, is not a subjective test that we can control for the right kind of sample. So if it's a blood test, it's blood that's going on, not urine. If it's a urine test, it's urine that's going on, not blood. Or in the case of children not wanting to go to school during COVID, that it's actually saliva going on, not orange juice, which was a good way of getting a positive.
I love the inventiveness of children.
Yeah. So we can make sure that the right sample is going on, and we can make sure that the right amount of sample is going on as well, using the Opal technology, which I think will help massively with bringing healthcare practitioners on board. The third set of people who need to be brought on board is the IT support and the administrators behind the system, because actually a lot of this could be run by administrators in a practice. It doesn't have to be the GP. I think it's in the Netherlands. If you are going to see a GP with symptoms of a cough or a cold, you will be administered a CRP test by the receptionist before you go in to see the doctor. And then the physical CRP test will be shown to the doctor, and they'll use that as part of their clinical assessment, which is exactly the right thing to be doing.
100%.
Yeah. So bringing everybody in the healthcare system along with us, I think, is going to be really important.
Yeah, that that last point especially, I think, is one of those most crucial points where the more information, the more insight that a practitioner has when someone comes to their surgery, the more effective they're going to be able to be. And as you say earlier in the conversation, many of the symptoms that will show up for a viral infection are exactly the same as a bacterial infection. So having that test further up the line better means that you're able to create that impact.
That patient with a viral infection at home instead of them spreading the virus around. I feel very strongly that people with a viral infection should not be coming into work, for example, at éclateral. We encourage people not to come in if they've got the sniffles. And that's probably, I don't know how widespread that is actually since the pandemic. I don't know if you've got any feel for that, but
I think there's definitely a sense that people are more conscientious about coming into the office or going out in general,
right?
With a cold, with something that they could pass on. Anecdotally, myself didn't go down to see my in-laws recently from the Easter weekend because I had a cold and I didn't want to pass it on to my wife's 98-year-old nan.
Right.
So there is certainly, when you haven't seen someone for a long time, there is that want to go. But actually, I think there is also a conscientiousness to say it's not the right decision.
Yeah.
And I'll stay at home and I'll recover and I'll get better. And then maybe afterwards we'll rearrange something.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. And I think it is about giving people the information that they need.
Actually, I did have one question about the test itself. Is the test reusable?
The test is not. But that's something that so within 3 years, we want our single-use tests to be fully compostable. That's our environmental goal.
Yeah.
And I think it's possible. So the plastic cassette, for example, can be replaced with something that is plant-based and would be compostable. We're taking the gold out of the system. I told you how the gold gives you the electrical measurement. We found a way of not using gold nanoparticles because we don't need that visual color change. So now we've got just biology on the system instead of chemistry, which it simplifies everything from a technology point of view, but also makes it a bit more environmentally friendly because you're not 100%. Using a rare precious metal in the test. The reader is spec'd to be reused 5,000 times. It's actually spec'd to be used 10,000 times, but we'll be saying 5,000 to give ourselves a margin of error. We want that reader to also be something that is completely reusable and repairable in time. That's a slightly longer project than the 3 year to compostable.
Amazing. Given that you've just articulated nicely the environmental timeline and what you're trying to do there. What is the short, medium, long-term time horizon goals and vision that you have with éclateral and Opal?
So we expect to get our CRP test into usability testing in care homes within the next probably 4 months. So we've been talking to a chain of care homes local to where we are down in Bristol, who are very interested in what we're doing and are willing to get their healthcare professionals involved in making sure that the system that we think is suitable for them is in fact usable. And that will lead to a full clinical trial in probably January 2025, with a view to getting regulatory approval within 3 to 6 months after that. So that's the first test that we expect to be taken to market. The second one will be the menopause test that we talked about, which will have 12 analytes, not a single analyte, 12 analytes. And so FSH is the hormone that people test for around the menopause. It is not adequate as a test. A single hormone varies enormously across the population as well as within an individual over time. And the time periods that we're talking about are not just the 40-year fertility cycle, but also on a daily or a monthly basis. So putting in 4 hormones instead of just 1 and trying to address some of the other symptoms, I suppose is probably the right word, but tiredness or brain fog. So let's look at your thyroid function and let's look at your diet all at the same time in a single test. So 12 analytes. We think that's going to take us 3 years to develop. It's worth doing that, not just for the 3 million women a year going through the perimenopause, but that same test would actually be useful to blokes as well. So I remember being 40 years old with 2 children and tired all the time and convinced that there was something wrong with me. Nah, it's just I was tired all the time, but there was no test to tell me that.
Yeah, of course.
And so we see this test that we'll be launching in a women's health setting because we want to make a bit of noise around women's health because it's underserved. That test will also be useful for other in other settings, just as a well-being test.
Absolutely. And I think that has even further application, obviously, if you consider the fact that we do have an aging population.
Yeah.
And this is only going to become more of a need. And that's 3 million in the UK. Presumably that market extends further afield as well. I don't know if there's any plans for éclateral and the team to scale over into the States or other markets, but
we absolutely will. I can't say that it's a plan at the moment. My feeling is, as someone who, this is my 5th company, I tend to get in early, do the early stuff, and then hand it over. So I don't think I'll be the person who necessarily is taking it to the States. My focus and my networks are in the UK. Yeah. So this is a UK test to feed the UK population in my head at the moment. But you're absolutely right. These are global problems.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you're most excited about to tackle next?
After éclateral?
Well, no. I mean, we can touch on that if you want,
No,
I meant the immediate future.
So one of the things I've been excited about is that we've engaged with clinicians to talk about PSA testing for men with prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is something that would affect all men over the age of 50 at some point. But most of us will, the prostate cancer will not be a problem for us. It'll stick within the prostate. And it's not something that we're going to die of, but it will give us an elevated PSA level. The elevated PSA level, therefore, is not diagnostic of a problem. It's diagnostic of cancer, but a cancer that you can live with and end up dying of something else. We think that the trends in PSA are going to be more informative than a single measurement, which is what men get at the moment. If after counselling, they decide that they want PSA test despite the risk of a false positive. What we've worked really hard at is keeping our costs down low. So the cost to the NHS of any one of our tests will be £2. And that means that a man could take 6 tests a year without probably 6 of our tests would probably cost less than it costs them for a single PSA test at the moment. But it gives you a lot more information and most importantly allows you to identify worrying trends rather than just a single snapshot that could be the result of a bicycle ride. You know, bicycle ride, the saddle will stimulate your prostate, your PSA levels go up just as a consequence of that. Yeah. You don't have any problem. You just had a bicycle ride. So I think being able to look at trends, and that's true for prostate cancer, it's true for women's health, all of the hormones that we've talked about, they all cycle, they all go up and down. It's being able to look at the trends over time that will give you the information that you need. I'm excited about both of those. Solving those problems. Solving the problems is what I like doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that leads me nicely on to the question of, what are you most hopeful about?
I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to reduce antibiotic prescriptions in care homes by 30% to the benefit of those patients who don't need them.
Incredible. And that's a lovely hopeful note to wrap up on. If people want to find out more, where can they go? Where should they look for you?
Okay, we're on LinkedIn, as everybody else is. We've got our own website, of course, www.éclateral.com. But also look out for our crowdfunding campaign that will be launching shortly. That crowdfunding campaign is not about funding the company as a business. It's more about making sure that we can bring that pregnancy test for blind women that I mentioned at the very beginning to reality. There were 25,000 blind women in the UK trying to get pregnant at any given time. It's too small a market to get a lot of investment in. The return on investment would just be too low for venture capital. But we think that an altruistic crowdfunding campaign to support that, so allow people to donate a small amount of money that we will use exclusively to develop the test, and then we will make 2 tests available, or perhaps more than that, because 2 might not be enough, to 25,000 blind women to allow us, so that'll pay for the development of the test and the supply of the test to 25,000 blind women for a year. So that crowdfunding campaign will launch on all of your favorite social media channels at some point soon.
Incredible. Paul, thank you so much for the work you're doing. It's incredibly inspiring, and I highly encourage people to check it out.
Thanks, Johnny. It's been a pleasure.